as you hopefully all know, the shutter speed of your camera controls how long the lens is open during exposure. A very fast shutter speed will essentially freeze the motion and give you an image with very little to almost no motion blur. However, a very slow shutter speed will result in a final image with a lot of motion blur. Have a look at these two images. Notice how in the left image, the falling ball has a lot more motion blur due to the slower shutter speed. The ball on the right side looks like it's almost frozen in time. When you record video, the shutter speed controls how much motion blur you get in every single frame, and therefore it affects the look and feel of your final footage. Now, where does the term shutter angle actually fit into all of this? Well, in analog motion picture cameras, they use something that is called a rotary disc shutter, which, looks something like this. The way this works is that the film is actually being pulled through behind the shutter, and for every frame, this shutter will rotate one full cycle. That means that if you're filming at 24 frames per second, this shutter will rotate 24 times a second. Now, how long each frame is exposed is actually determined by the cutout of this shutter. Now, the angle of this cutout is what is actually referred to as the shutter angle. If you are shooting at 24 frames per second, the shutter takes exactly 1/24th of a second to do one full rotation. If your shutter angle is 180 degrees, the shutter is basically cut in half. Each frame is exposed for exactly half the time it takes the shutter to do one full rotation, which is 1/48th of a second. Please be aware that the shutter angle actually describes your shutter speed in relation to the frame rate. If you were shooting at 30 frames per second, a shutter angle of 180 degrees would mean a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. Now let's look at what happens when your shutter angle is 240 degrees. In this case, 2/3 of the shutter have been cut out. Therefore, each frame will be exposed for 2/3 of the time it takes the shutter to do one full rotation, which is 1/36th of a second. Notice that the larger shutter angle actually means a longer exposure per frame and therefore will result in more motion blur. Now let's look at what happens with a 90-degree shutter angle. In this case, the frame is exposed for a quarter of the time it takes the shutter to do one full rotation, which is 1/96th of a second. With a smaller shutter angle, the cutout is smaller, leading to a shorter exposure time per frame and therefore to less motion blur. In motion pictures, the most commonly used shutter angle is 180 degrees. That means if you're filming at 24 frames per second, set your shutter speed to 1/48th of a second. Now, that option is most likely not going to be available on your camera, so just use the closest option, which is probably going to be 1/50th of a second. If you're filming at 30 frames per second, set your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. That will give you the standard amount of motion blur that most people are used to seeing in the cinema. Now, finally, here are 3 clips filmed at 240, 180 and 90-degree shutter angle. Using a 240-degree shutter angle emphasizes motion blur and gives your footage a very smooth feel. A 180-degree shutter angle gives you a standard amount of motion blur that people are very used to seeing in the cinema. A 90-degree shutter angle restricts motion blur, making every frame very sharp. This results in an intensified adrenaline feel that is often used in war or horror movies. Well, I hope this tutorial has helped you understand what shutter angle is, why it is so important, and how you can use it to make your DSLR footage look more like film. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more good stuff coming soon. Until then, see you later.